Hello, and welcome to AWS Review, a weekly look at what's happening at AWS and how it may change how you do business. I am your host, Michael Krause. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Charter Solutions, where we help companies change and innovate quickly by accelerating their acquisition and use of data.
And I'm your co-host, John Affolter. So I'm a lead technical architect on the AWS specialist team at Salesforce, where I help potential customers, helping them envision the possibilities that AWS and Salesforce enables. All right.
Excellent. Welcome back. It's been 2 weeks. We missed last week due to a U.S. national holiday. But we are back in the saddle, and we will be running every week now for a while. Good to see you again, John.
Yeah, good to see you. Well, Michael, we always do the witty banter about weather, and I think we finally broke through. I think
it's starting to actually feel like summer, though. I woke up and it was 60 degrees outside again. So it's winter's just like really, really trying to hold on as long as it possibly can. But things are growing, things are green. We're having some nice days.
Yeah, one of these days we're going to be complaining about how hot it is now. So,
well, living in Minnesota, that's, it's either like 30 below or 100 degrees. So we just have to live with it unless we want to move.
Yeah. So I know you have reInvent here on the docket coming, looking ahead here. And
that's what, about 6 months from now. It's usually end of November when reInvent happens.
Yeah. And I know that, here at Salesforce, we're really working hard to, find really good stories to talk and bring to reInvent. So I'm excited to kind of see how that gets worked out over the next couple months here. And it should be a really good one this year.
Yeah. I usually go every other year. I used to go every year. And then it got to a point where, I keep up with all the changes via the podcast and their news blog and all of that stuff. So the new announcements isn't that big of a deal for me anymore. It becomes more of a network opportunity and a chance to meet some companies who are doing some really interesting stuff. But it's gotten so big that it's really hard to hit sessions that you want to hit. And the expo, is sprawled across multiple venues as well and has gotten so huge. It's almost getting to the point where you spend more time moving around than you do actually interacting with people.
Yeah, no, it's just going to be, I think, just ridiculous of how big it is getting, especially now that we've had to go through COVID and people haven't seen each other for a while. So I think it's definitely going to be a big one this year.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And it's, I'd like to go. I'm still making the final decisions on this one, but it's a great conference. It just takes a lot more planning now than it used to.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely will try to be there, and I don't see how I wouldn't be there. But and then also have Dreamforce as well. So Dreamforce is coming up even a little sooner, but I think it's good we have a few months to kind of do a lot of that planning for reInvent. So I'm looking forward to it. So before we move on to our topic of the day, which is Amazon EventBridge, which I'm really excited about this topic. Let's take a look at some of the stuff that AWS did last week, which they're always doing. Each week I'm kind of amazed what they come out with. So this week, Amazon EMR is now serverless and it's now generally available. So, now you can really run your EMR clusters without managing all the servers, which, kind of is I would say kind of a big blocker, I guess, to kind of going with EMR in the first place, is that you have to set all that up. But at the same time, it's kind of almost an anti-pattern with the serverless on EMR, because the big thing about EMR is that you can do those transient workloads and, leverage spot instances and stuff like that. But again, it's everything's moving towards serverless, taking away, thinking about that. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on this one, Michael? I know you always have interesting thoughts about EMR.
It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see where EMR fits, EMR serverless fits in the whole kind of ecosystem that Amazon's put together. And this may be a good topic for a future session, because I think there's a few things we need to consider. There's traditional Amazon EMR versus kind of host your own kind of Hadoop cluster. There's Amazon Glue Jobs, which runs Spark, and Amazon Athena, which is Presto, right? So when we take a look at EMR serverless, the question becomes, what's its niche? What's the right use of EMR serverless versus Glue Jobs and Athena versus traditional EMR? And also, what's the pricing look like? Recently we had that conversation on AWS Lambda versus Elastic Container Service, and where does it make sense cost wise to use Lambda versus ECR? I think there's going to be some interesting perspectives with regard to EMR serverless versus Glue Jobs and versus traditional EMR as to what types of workloads fit best in each, both from a performance and use case model, as well as from a cost perspective.
Yeah, it's it gets really confusing almost, I guess, for people that really aren't in it, especially when you have to think, under the hood, it's glue is just Spark, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. And
Yep.
I don't know, I think the marketing team has their work cut out for it, but I'm really interested to kind of see where that fits on the roadmap. And I guess I always look at the blogs, so the more blogs that are written about something, I feel like it's going to be more important. So
Absolutely. So the other app news that's come out is AWS Data Sync, which has been around for a while, and allows you to kind of move data between on-premise servers and things like that back and forth to AWS storage locations like S3, Elastic File System, FSX, etc. It's been around for a while as a tool for kind of synchronizing data between the AWS storage services and your local storage mechanisms. Well, they've just announced availability for using data sync to move data also to non-AWS storage services like Google Cloud Storage and Microsoft Azure Files. So that's now available. You can integrate with those and move files back and forth from those locations as well.
Yeah, another interesting move, and another one where as we move towards that multi-cloud type environment, I feel like there's going to be one ring to rule them all, I guess, for lack of a better term. But I guess I think this helps AWS kind of be that the data lake of data lakes, I guess. So
yeah, I saw an article the other day that was interesting, which the general idea of the article was that Amazon's kind of got that number one place in cloud.
mm-hmm.
And their game now isn't to drive everybody else out, but when people need multi-cloud and things like that, to be the number one.
Yep,
the primary. So we're on AWS, and secondarily we use Google, Azure, or both. So
yeah,
they're building a lot more of these support integrations to be able to allow that to occur and let people use AWS as kind of their primary.
yeah, no, and I think I guess that's a really good segue, because I think that EventBridge is one of those things that kind of helps solidify that too. So
Excellent. Yes. So today our primary topic is Amazon EventBridge, and we want to take a look at EventBridge's history, kind of what was it, and what changes has it gone through, and what is it today, maybe where it's going, and how it can be leveraged to help companies, take themselves to the next level when it comes to digital data convergence.
absolutely. So Michael, there's we talk about EventBridge, but what are these event buses, and maybe what are some of the nuances that um, you know between different types of bridges or event buses, and kind of how that's evolved over time.
Sure. So broadly speaking, speaking beyond AWS, the concept of an event bus has been around for a long time, and there's been various software companies and software solutions that you could use to incorporate an event bus into how you build things on premise. And EventBridge has been around for a while as well on AWS. And when it originally came out, it was primarily a mechanism, or at least the primary way people used it, was to take events from external systems and make them available to your system. So, for example, if I'll use Salesforce as an example since you work for Salesforce.
Yep.
If a new contact or a new opportunity is created in Salesforce, how do you trigger an AWS Lambda from that?
Yep.
Right. And not wait for your nightly batch download of opportunity changes from Salesforce and try to react to a whole bunch of them at the same time. How do you respond right away? And EventBridge provided that mechanism. And over time, what they've done is they've added more and more features to it, including things like taking things that originally were bundled with CloudWatch, like CloudWatch rules for scheduling things, and moving those over to EventBridge to make it a more cohesive service around event publishing and event subscribing. And for people who may not be familiar with event-driven solutions, the idea of an event is that something occurred, right? A new opportunity was created. Somebody edited the opportunity, but something happened. Data changed in some way. That's the conceptual event.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, the people who are interested in the event, the consumers or subscribers, they're the ones who potentially want to do something when that event occurs, right? So we create a new opportunity, and I immediately want to let the head of sales know that a new opportunity was created, right? Well, there are things in Salesforce that can do that, but I could write an AWS Lambda to do that as well and use EventBridge to take and ingest that event from Salesforce and then pass it on to a Lambda and trigger that Lambda execution.
Yeah, I think with EventBridge, we always used to talk about this years ago, Michael, and you're like, yeah, I was like, I keep seeing EventBridge on the blogs. I feel like I feel like they're really kind of making a move here. What I guess, you kind of referred to this a little bit before, but what are some of these kind of more recent updates to EventBridge that have really kind of pushed it to the forefront? And
yeah,
what do you think for the future? As we move forward, how is it evolving right now?
Yeah, and I want to be cautious here because a lot of the features that are in EventBridge have been introduced kind of over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened in my mind is it's recently hit a point where there's a critical mass. We've hit a tipping point, and more companies are now starting to move from the kind of the old best practice solutions of SNS topics and SNS plus SQS and things like that for event notification fully over to EventBridge. And we're seeing similar things with other AWS services like Amazon QuickSight. Initially it was an interesting tool, but they've been adding more and more features, and it's hitting that tipping point of becoming the go-to tool for visualizations. So let's swing back to EventBridge. So what features in EventBridge make it interesting? So a few of them. One is the ability to create event buses and have multiple event buses that could handle different domains of events. Allows you to organize events differently. That doesn't say you can't put multiple different types of events on a single event bus, but you've got that flexibility. All AWS events that could be used to trigger things run through event bus now. Even if you don't know that you're doing that, that's what's really happening, right? So if you say, hey, I want to when a new file is put in S3, I want to trigger a Lambda to process that file, that S3 event processes through event bus in some way. You can process it through your own bus and add a little more capability around it. It also supports many different event sources out of the box. So you've got things like SaaS applications, applications that are not AWS, Salesforce, we've talked about, Shopify, Datadog, MongoDB, PagerDuty, Zendesk, and many others. AWS services, like we talked about. But the other one is custom applications and microservices. So your applications can publish events and have those events be processed by downstream systems. So, we've talked a lot about publishing events, ingesting events from other systems. How do you subscribe? So another feature is event rules. And what an event rule is a description of, I want events that match a certain type of metadata to be sent to me. So it's a filter of sorts. But it's a very powerful filter because those event rules and what happens after them allow you to filter based on metadata. You can filter based on content, so you can actually introspect the event data itself and say, oh, hey, it's JSON. I'm only, interested in events where, this deeply nested JSON value is X, right? So you've got a lot of granularity in your ability to identify which events you're interested in as a consuming application. With that, you could also then, once the event has been identified as one you're interested in, you have the ability within Event Bus to run a transformation on the content of that event. So if for some reason you need it in a different structure, you can make that happen. So pros and cons on that, we can maybe talk about that later. There's reasons why you want to stick to a standardized model if at all possible, rather than constantly transforming. But there are, especially for legacy integration reasons, why you might want to do a transform. And then the final piece is targets. So if you think about SNS, simple notification service, there are HTTP endpoints, you can do SMS. There's a few different targets you can hit. You can target SQS and then consume off an SQS queue. There are over 35 different target types supported by EventBridge, including API endpoints. So you can have an event coming in, triggers a rule that says, yes, I'm interested in that event, transforms the data, and then makes an API call to your REST API to invoke it and pass that data through, which makes integrating with existing microservices that are REST-based much simpler. Rather than rewriting them to be, asynchronous, driven off a queue or something like that. Though there may be scenarios where that makes more sense.
Yeah, really working, as we get into this API driven world, it's, you can kind of get into that danger zone of doing a lot of point to point integrations. And, this is, this is a big thing, EventBridge. And also just thinking from my point of view, from the Salesforce side, we are introducing Event Relay and really trying to integrate that a lot with EventBridge and moving towards that event driven architecture that we spoke about on some previous shows here. What are your thoughts in EventBridge and how, what are some of the ways that it's reducing these point to point integrations? You kind of referred to it before, but I think about it too in an interesting way of just kind of like a machine learning pipeline or different ways that you can quickly spin up different prototypes or use cases from being able to kind of create a quick or custom bus really quickly. I guess what are your thoughts on that reducing of the point to point integrations?
So point to point integrations. So I'll talk about two things. One is point to point integrations. But the other one is the concept of how tightly coupled all your different services are, right? So as soon as you tightly couple things together, they become highly dependent on each other, and changes to one oftentimes have impacts on the other and require changes in the other. When you can loosely couple those things, especially from a change independence perspective, then it creates scenarios where you have much more flexibility in adapting your architectures and your systems to new technologies, to new market situations, things like that. but it also allows you to tie together more diverse solutions like Salesforce and AWS custom apps and things like that, right? I was looking at Event Relay, and one of the cool things about Event Relay is it's bi-directional.
Yep.
It's not just Salesforce events coming into AWS, but you can now pass AWS events back to Salesforce.
Yeah.
So, in as you move kind of through generations of application architecture approaches, you think about the monolith where everything talked to each other inside a single process.
Mhm.
Then you go to, microservices where now you're trying to talk to each other across APIs. But the question is, do you need to know who's on the other end of that call,
Mhm.
right? Oh, well, I can avoid that by using things like API discovery mechanisms and registries. I can abstract the implementation with an API gateway of some sort, so I'm not tied to the specific deployment anymore. But I'm still tied to this concept of I know I need service X, right? Event driven starts to change that a little bit more, right? So now it's like you can say, I need this done rather than I need service X, right? I need somebody to take this image and tell me who it is, right? So run a ML image identification, image recognition model against it, right? Do I care if it's ML? Do I care if it's implemented in a microservice? Do I care if it's some third party doing it? Do I care if it's John Affolter sitting there looking at the image and looking things up and saying, this is who it is?
Mhm.
For me, I really don't. I just care about, do I get an answer back and do I get it back in a timely manner? So using something like an event-driven mechanism as the communication availability, all you do is raise an event and say, hey, I have this image. I need to know who this is.
Mhm.
And then some subscriber to those types of requests picks that up, does the processing, raises an event back to say, hey, image identified. And then I can pick that event back up off the bridge. So now I've completely decoupled and I can swap things out. I could potentially, play a quorum game where I put it out there and, if the majority of the people say it's Michael Krause on that, I will believe them, but I can actually have multiple people over a period of time respond back.
Yeah, and yeah, then it's oh, by the way, once you've identified who this person is, then you also have all these other things that could get kicked off after that. And
Yeah.
that's just I think that's really cool. And um I think not to go off the EventBridge route, but I think EventBridge and integrating also with Slack and some of these other things like AWS Ground Truth or augmented AI, like you
Yep.
said with a quorum. And I really think that there's a big opportunity there. And, not to be biased here, but also with Salesforce and obviously Slack and having that all integrate with EventBridge and really being able to power a lot of that ground truth and
Yep.
really advance advance AI algorithms over time through feedback from the human element. So I think there's a really interesting path there.
Well, and we did a session early on about kind of the convergence of applications and data and cloud and all that stuff. That I've started throwing the moniker digital data convergence around to kind of try to represent that. But if you think about and again, let's keep using Salesforce as an example, right? We've got a rich set of data in Salesforce, and a lot of companies are using Salesforce to manage a lot of different things, right? The ability for real-time changes to be passed through via EventBridge to AWS means I can have apps that can respond to that. Well,
Mhm.
that's interesting, right? But when it comes across as a event in EventBridge, I can have many different apps take a look
Mhm.
at it, right? So when you talk about, ground truth and being able to supply models and stuff like execute models, collecting data to train models,
Mhm.
right? There is no reason why I couldn't have a simple Lambda or something else, fire hose, that just listens to certain types of events coming over and writes the results of those things out to S3 into a data lake. And that's
Yeah.
all it does. It just collects it. While other rules are picking that up and doing processing with it, sending it to other third parties and partners. But basically by listening on that event bus, you can serve multiple purposes simultaneously with that data.
Mhm.
Where in the past, what you had to do was you had to create separate integrations, right? So my app had to integrate with Salesforce. Oh, my data warehouse had to integrate with Salesforce. And
Mhm.
I did it differently. One, I might be making API calls. The other one, I might be using Informatica and a Salesforce connector.
Yep.
But everyone was different. And I had multiple integrations dealing with the data differently. Now, not only could I get the data real time, I can have it come through in a consistent manner. And I have the opportunity just to say, hey, I'm interested in that.
Mhm.
And now, I've got one Salesforce integration and multiple consumers of that information.
Yeah, it's really driving. We like to really push that unified developer experience, the unified experience. And to your point, it's, hey, if you're going into Salesforce and you have these little boxes and dashboards and everything, nobody needs to know where that data is being processed and how it's being
Right.
served up. All they know is that here it is right in front of their face. And another one of your points is that it's bidirectional. So
Right.
they're creating and they can interact with that data in real time and not have to wait for that. And I think that's really the thing that's going to drive that unified experience, is that bidirectional capability.
Yeah. And we're using Salesforce as an example here, but I mean, it could be anything.
Yeah.
They have pre-built things for Zendesk and Mongo, Page, all these different things, but you could build your own integrations and just feed them into EventBridge, right? So if you're running an ERP system, you could build something that would send stuff out from that ERP system to EventBridge that can then be processed, right? So changes in financials, changes in orders, and things like that. Um, and because for example, with Event Relay, it's bidirectional, but you also can hit endpoints, API endpoints with EventBridge. You could say, hey, this order closed. I could, through EventBridge and Event Relay, update an opportunity in Salesforce automatically. But I could also then go into my financial system and make an entry in there that the event that it closed, and I could update my analytics systems by
Yeah.
just publishing one event.
It gets kind of crazy. And I think it kind of goes back to the other thing we were saying about AWS. They already are in the lead. So this is just another thing that it doesn't matter what you're working on. It just continuously brings data back into AWS somehow. And I think it's really interesting the way that they do that, and how they work
Yep.
with partners and really accelerate that.
Well, and the other piece is, and the concepts of this kind of event bus based systems is not new,
Yeah.
but there are companies who are literally originally built around this concept.
Mhm.
And there's one big one out there. I won't mention their name, but people who know them know who they are.
Yeah.
But the cost of investment in those is a high capital cost, right?
Mhm.
I knew a sales engineer for this company who made very big dollars just because of the size of the deals that had to happen.
Yep.
So you make very large upfront capital expenditures to buy this software, install it, get it configured, and now you have to build. EventBridge makes those same capabilities available to everybody because you pay for usage, not for upfront license fees and infrastructure, right? If you want to use EventBridge and want to run one event through a month, you can do that. And you pay for that one event,
Mhm.
right? And as volumes increase, you pay for the volume. So it makes the capability of doing this type of event-driven development, event-driven architectures, and event kind of uh, driven change to how you actually build all your systems available to everyone.
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously working at Salesforce, we charge and do billing a little bit differently than AWS, which is a very interesting dynamic working with both teams. So it's very I'm definitely I think it's definitely an interesting thing to think about as this partnership develops too, is just kind of the differences in motivations and differences in how things are sold and consumption based stuff. So
Right.
um, but yeah, I think EventBridge is obviously a really robust tool, but what are some of the challenges with it? What are some of the things that
Yeah.
it's worked
Yeah.
out?
So like everything, there's that old adage that, when you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
Oh yeah, yep.
And things like EventBridge and event-driven architectures and stuff is a very glamorous, exciting concept, but you do need to be cautious. You know, so let's start with talking about event-driven systems in general, and then we'll talk about challenges specifically with EventBridge. So event-driven systems in general are hard to trace.
Oh yeah.
Right? So I have system A, it raises an event, and I've got 500 other systems that consume that event, publish 500 more events, and another 500 systems consume all of those 500 events, right?
The curse of dimensionality.
Exactly. There was a book a long time ago that was discussing the network effect of communication, right? And when you've got two people talking, you have one communication channel.
Mhm.
When you have three people talking, you've got three communication channels. As soon as you go beyond that, you've got exponential explosion of communication channels, right? So how do you trace? I mean, this is like the ultimate in distributed systems because you do not have a predefined path
Mhm.
through them, right? You've got rules that get applied that sometimes this goes to this one and sometimes it doesn't. And it's really driven by the rule, not driven by any quote unquote, point to point integration. And that's the things that have a nice, clean, very programmatic procedural flow are easy to debug and easy to trace because we do A, then B, then C, then D. But here it's like I say A happened, and people who want to do B, they determine if they want to do B based
Yeah,
on the data associated with A.
yeah.
So while it's really exciting, realize that it does have a cost with regard to observability and debugging and production troubleshooting, right? So things like Amazon CloudWatch, Datadog, X-Ray, um, these things become important. Open telemetry, which is an open API specification for distributed tracing, right? To be able to take that event A and trace it through all the different systems that decided to process event A, having that kind of a visibility and observability becomes critical. So while exciting, while very glamorous and interesting, you have to be a little bit cautious because there are times where it makes more sense to do something procedurally or semi procedurally than it does to do it in an event-based manner. And there's lots of conversations out there by many people on the web. Martin Fowler's got a few. Go and look at them. But let's talk about EventBridge specifically. So EventBridge, as we talked about before, allows you to, process these events, create rules, transform them, things like that. I don't think we mentioned it, but it has retry capability up to 24 hours. So if it tries to invoke an API or send an event and it fails, it'll keep retrying for up to 24 hours. It has transformation, things like that. But a couple of things that it doesn't have. One is first in, first out. So unlike, say, for example, Amazon Kinesis or Amazon SQS FIFO queues, it doesn't have any support for ordering. So if you send 500 messages in, one right after the other, there's no guarantee that they will be coming out the other end in the exact same order that you put them in. So that's something you need to be aware of. If you absolutely need that kind of sequencing, then you need to be looking at a different tool like Kinesis, SQS FIFO queues, things like that. The other one is they guarantee an at least once delivery. What that means, though, is it might get delivered more than once.
Yeah.
Right?
Old item potent.
Yep. So you have to be, and I'm I hear different people pronounce it differently. I've always pronounced it idempotent, but idempotency of your receivers, of your consumers of the events. You have to recognize that the same event will be delivered at least once, but it could be delivered 2 or more times. So for people who aren't familiar with the concept of idempotency, it's the idea that if you invoke something more than once with with the same information, the resulting state will always be the same.
Mhm.
And the example I always use is in programming, the difference between um, a function that adds 2 numbers together
Mhm.
versus a function that increments, right? So if I have a function that, adds 2 numbers together and you give it 2 and 2, it'll always give you back 4, no matter how many times you call it with 2 and 2, right? But a function that increments a number all the time, every time you call it, it's going to add 1 that number. So if you call it 3 times, it's going to end up adding 3 to a number, right? So that's something you have to be cautious about. And in distributed systems, this concept becomes more and more important. And people who are really building good ones build this in all the time. But it
Mhm.
is something you have to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not thinking about that, that can get really ugly really quickly
Yeah.
if you do it in the wrong way. So, have you ever, you always have a lot of good stories. Have you ever had any nightmare stories of the curse of dimensionality and events kind of building on each other? Or any good horror stories out there?
I have had some, but I'll be honest, most of them haven't run around the idempotency problem.
Yeah.
Most of them have run around other things, because what ends up happening most of the time when you get into these event-driven systems is you deal with volume,
Hmm.
right? Um, Part of the reason why you do these things is because you have a high volume of things. It's not a simple thing to just, oh, I can build a simple piece. You need something to scale fast. You need to process a lot of things. And a lot of things happen. You find a lot of things when you put a lot of load on it, right? So, I tell a lot of people that when you build systems on AWS, you have to load test them, not necessarily to validate that they will handle the load, but to see what you missed in handling issues in your code.
Yep. Yeah.
Because as soon as you apply load, you start running into things like, oh, I forgot that API gets throttled.
Hmm.
Right. And that throttling can happen. And if you're not doing exponential back off and retry on those API calls, especially almost all of the AWS SDK calls, you will run into errors, right?
Hmm.
Um, Memory leaks. If there is a small memory leak in your code, you will find it very quickly under load,
Yeah.
right? Um, or if there's a small memory leak in a piece of code that's given to you by another organization, like a library, I ran into this recently, you will find that as well. With the recent Log4j stuff, there was one Log4j library that was updated by some organization, and all of a sudden lambdas started failing when we were running our load tests because they were running out of memory, and chased it back, found out it was the library change, and they had quickly come out with some new versions of it, but we got past that. But you find a lot of things when you're running under load, but you do have to be really careful about the idempotency issue.
Yeah.
Trying to think what. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I think it really, you really have to do some advanced, programming and really take that into account, especially, like to your point, at things at volume, and when you're, you're working with a lot of different pipelines that are all moving at different speeds. It's good. It's sometimes really hard to figure out where you're getting those problems, and it's kind of really serendipitous that last week we had the telemetry update that came out, and just things like that are helping out. But I know that you like Datadog too, and yeah,
Well,
I think
that's
it's a really
and Datadog
interesting.
is one, but there's also New Relic, there's Splunk, there's all kinds of tools out there. Um, and Amazon has been continuing to upgrade and add more capability to to CloudWatch. And it's been interesting over the last probably year and a half. I've really seen that ramp up. And I think they are responding to the market in that there is a need for better and better observability and at a finer grained level to be able to trace this stuff through distributed systems.
Yeah, and it's really interesting seeing how AWS responds to that, and it's kind of almost like the EMR versus Spark thing too. It's like there's so many different ways to do the same thing now. It's really interesting to see how the marketing of AWS and a lot of the things that are connected to it kind of drives strategy too as well. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because strategy is an important thing. AWS is very customer focused and very customer driven. So a lot of what they build is because customers are asking for it.
Yeah. Yep.
And we don't always see why the customers are asking for it. So the serverless EMR. Well, Glue's out there. That's kind of serverless, and at least for Spark stuff. Athena's out there for Presto stuff. What else are they looking for? So there must be other things that are coming to the table in that kind of niche of serverless EMR that's not met by traditional EMR or AWS Glue and Athena that people are asking for. So getting into that and understanding where some of these things fit is important. Same thing with EventBridge. We had SNS and we had SQS, and a common pattern for, event notification, earlier was let's attach, SQS and SNS together because I can fan out, do a topic based notification with SNS and have that drop onto multiple SQS queues. And, SNS plus SNS filters plus an SQS queue is a way in an async manner of subscribing to certain events that are published through SNS. What's going to be interesting to me is, will SNS eventually go the route of, was it Simple DB?
No.
You remember that?
Oh yeah. Hardly, but yeah.
You start adding more endpoints and saying, well, yeah, I can deliver to AWS chatbot, which gives you Slack integration, things like that. I can deliver to SMS. I can event Amazon Pinpoint with EventBridge, which gives me SMS access, text messages, emails. Suddenly, which is better, EventBridge or SNS? Or has SNS just been consumed into EventBridge?
Yeah, and Salesforce pricing is pretty easy compared to AWS. And so I'm really interested to see kind of how the billing factor comes in and where that trade-off might be between the ease of use and then just, pure either volume or just lowering the cost and kind of where companies will trade off. And yeah,
so I'll give you a concrete example, and maybe we do a session one of these days on cost comparisons of similar types of technologies, right?
I think that would be a great one.
Just did a cost comparison of DynamoDB versus S3 for small files.
Yep.
And of course, there's a spot where S3 is more expensive. There's a spot where DynamoDB doesn't work as well, right? And so understanding that sometimes is important. But I had a customer I was working with recently who was looking at using SNS plus SQS as a pub sub mechanism. And we compared that to EventBridge. Feature-wise, EventBridge seemed to meet everything it had and had a whole bunch more. So it was, kind of a winner from a pure feature comparisons perspective. But when we looked at cost, it was interesting because you got to look carefully at the pricing pages. You can configure AWS to have an SQS queue read from SNS. So you can have SNS events propagated to multiple SQS queues. But even within a region, there is a data transfer cost.
Yeah, the old data
from SNS to SQS.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, that made a big difference in the cost models between EventBridge and SNS plus SQS.
That's, I know we're running up here on time, but yeah, I think I just saw one about, hey, or some article that said, hey, didn't you forget about the data transfer costs though? And I think, yeah, I think we should definitely do a whole show on those pricing comparisons because they're definitely very interesting. And
Yeah, and I've recently for my real job had to do, we've already talked about Lambda versus ECS, but I've also been doing SQS versus um, um, not SQS, SQS and SNS versus EventBridge, S3 versus DynamoDB for small files. The other one was Secrets Manager versus Parameter Store for credential management. Secrets Manager is kind of purpose built for it. Parameter Store has a lot of the features. Parameter Store is less expensive, but at scale, the cost per item request grows fast enough that the other costs are negligible at high scale, right? So that might be another interesting one to dive into, is do some cost comparisons of these different items. But I wanted to go back to you kind of brought strategy up, and more in the context of Amazon's strategy for how they do product planning and product development. But I think another aspect is the question of when companies are doing their strategies for how they build systems, how they integrate systems and things like that. The concept of EventBridge and event-driven systems is an important thing to keep in mind. And there's a balancing act. So as we mentioned before, there are certain post-development complexities that exist in an event-driven system with regard to observability, traceability, understanding, even bringing a new person into the team and getting them to understand how the system works. Because there's a little bit of, it feels like magic that happens, right? If you don't understand all the different pieces. And how do you document that? How do you keep that documentation alive? But the other aspect of it, which we alluded to earlier, is adaptability within your systems, right? So, I mean, people who've been around for a while, especially using, off-the-shelf software, ERP systems and things like that, we always joke about companies. We bought this ERP system and then we customized the heck out of it. And then we effectively poured cement around everything. Because now the cost of changing to a different ERP system or even upgrading to the next version of the ERP system that we bought is horribly expensive, right? So you don't have a lot of adaptability and changeability. And especially with the cloud and all the capabilities that it's bringing and how people are leveraging it, we're seeing technology change faster and faster, right? In the past, you had relational databases. Do you want to install Oracle or Dynamo or SQL Server or Postgres, right? And changing from one to the other was very expensive. Well, nowadays, spinning up SQL Server, Oracle, and Postgres on AWS is really easy. AWS Data Migration Service and Schema, the Schema comparison and mapping tool, make it even easier to move from one to the other. So we're seeing things, more and more technologies are coming out. Now you've got DynamoDB, you've got Keyspaces, which is a managed serverless version of Apache Cassandra. So you've got new things that are coming into the market that may either provide more capability to an organization or reduce the cost of operations if you can take advantage of them. So having adaptability in there, having the ability to abstract the implementation from the concept of what you're doing, having the ability to loosely couple all of your integrations makes it much easier, right? So, for example, we could say, hey, we want to now, in an event-driven system, we're writing all this data to an Oracle database for data warehousing purposes. But if it's all coming in through EventBridge, for example, we could say, well, we want to start doing a data lake. Well, we could just write a piece of code that starts taking those events and writing them to Amazon S3 as well. And while that's happening behind the scenes, we work on exporting what we've got history-wise out of Oracle right? Once we have that history exported, now we've got two systems that are simultaneously being updated just because we're tapping into the same inbound data flow. Now we take it to the next step and we say, okay, let's start moving our usage over to the data lake. And then we just shut down Oracle.
Yeah.
So we've got higher flexibility and adaptability. So when organizations are thinking about their technology strategy needs to bridge across technology we use for product development, technology we use for back office, technology we use for analytics, across all these things, and look at them more holistically and have a strategy for how we use it holistically that supports all of these capabilities within the organization.
Yeah, and really, you can just do it and, like charter the pull model and be able to do it in sync with everything else and not have to mess things up in production or not, you can shift the change management of it too, and the skill sets and everyone working on it and make that really a smooth transition. So
yeah,
I'm really excited to see kind of how EventBridge drives a lot of these architectures. And I guess I was going to ask too, what are some of the other things that you can do with EventBridge? I know that you spoke about it a little bit about retrying, but how about working with SQS or any of the other things or the challenges or ways that you can kind of bolt on other things to kind of handle some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about transformations. We talked about the end, the kind of the end targets.
Mm-hmm.
SQS, for example, is a target for EventBridge. So, for example, if you did want to do a async system that read off a queue, you can read off SQS, but you just create a rule that passed those EventBridge events to your SQS queue that then your application can consume. There are, I think, over 35 different destinations. I'll try to put a link in the show notes out there, but a lot of different things you can do. One thing we didn't mention was EventBridge has a schema registry and schema discovery capability.
Yeah,
So if you're working with canonical models and event models, you can actually store those things in the schema registry and discover those things as well. So lots of cool things coming.
That's huge with the schema registry, especially as you're working with all these different data types. And that I think is probably one of the biggest accelerators of just being able to really take something from your head and be able to hook everything up. And I think that EventBridge it could be kind of like I don't want to say it like a landing point for things, but really it will be an integration hub for a lot of different sources, especially as we move towards a lot more software as a service applications or even think about stuff like Snowflake too. Is that another really interesting concept of, hey, it's a SaaS database, and on the cloud. It's pretty interesting concept of how SaaS as well is, again, not to be biased from the Salesforce side, but how SaaS is influencing overall architectures as well. So
absolutely,
I think that's another interesting show that we could have too. Is how do you secure all of these different SaaS products that are all integrated together?
That would be a whole nother live stream series.
Yeah.
But I think we can touch on it and give people ideas, if nothing else.
Yeah. I like to, I try to be careful when talking about anything security, because then you're signing yourself up for something.
Exactly. Excellent. So, it's about 24 after the hour. We're kind of hitting up. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or questions, John?
I mean, Michael, me, I could sit here and ask you about a billion questions for the next couple hours, but what are you seeing for EventBridge, and where I want to maybe not get off topic here, but I've seen, and I know you're a big fan of, I've seen Slack really kind of take off, and I think that Slack integrations with EventBridge and Slack could become the new AWS console, essentially. I feel like almost like, you can kick off so much stuff from there. And I think that EventBridge is one of those things that really can facilitate that. But what are your thoughts on Slack and EventBridge and just having that be a place to kick things off, I guess?
Yeah. So I agree. Slack, well used, can be a very powerful tool.
Mhm.
Um, and the and there's kind of the whole yes or no kind of thing. Slack can be very ad hoc. You want to be careful not to kick things off. So sometimes by accident, right?
Yeah.
So leveraging things like Slack workflows to say, hey, I want to kick this off. And if it's a formal thing, maybe it has to go through an approval or ask a are you sure kind of thing.
Yep.
But I'll take it a little bit beyond Slack. You think Slack integration, think Atlassian integrations, think Zapier, think if this then that, think all kinds of things, right? There are lots of different ways this stuff could be integrated into these things. And I would not be surprised if there are a number of companies, I've not looked into it, a number of companies that have both inbound and outbound capabilities tied into EventBridge already that helps facilitate this kind of thing, right? You could, by having a slash command, turn Slack into your AWS CLI potentially at some point in time, or a mechanism that triggers stuff within the system, kick off workflows via step functions, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of different options. But I think the key thing is the integrations, right? And what's the right approach for a company with regard to how it's governed and managed.
Yeah, I think it's almost like there's too many choices. It's you get paralysis by analysis so much. So that's one of the main things that we're trying to focus on my team is what are these common patterns? Like there's a billion different ways to do it, but what are these repeatable patterns? And I think that EventBridge kind of, for lack of a better term, it bridges the gap with a lot of those things. And I think, What do you think EventBridge? What do you think the next step is, or if there was a feature that you could tell the product team to improve? What do you think that would be?
Boy, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And EventBridge is already kind of tied into CloudWatch and things like that. I think. When I think about the world today, one of the things where EventBridge can really play a powerful role is in normalizing a lot of data-driven integrations, right? So how do we take that to the next step? How do we build a robust and vibrant ecosystem that allows EventBridge to consume from more places and publish to more places outside of AWS? Adapters and things like that. How do we make that happen? We talked about Slack a little bit, but it could be any number of things. And how do we make that now usable by everybody without a huge barrier? I don't have to go pay $100,000 to get the XYZ adapter. It's out there, it's available to use, and it's very simple to leverage directly with EventBridge rather than me having to go write a piece of code that makes it work.
Yeah, and just really, how do you create kind of like a schema registry, but how do you create like almost playbooks? I would think kind of it could be almost like an extension of the AWS marketplace. Is almost
that's the way I think about it. Is you have a group under marketplace, which is EventBridge adapters, inbound and outbound, right? So that you can talk to whatever system you want.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept. And at Salesforce we have like App Exchange, which is like marketplace, and then we're doing custom ones for certain companies. And I'm kind of almost interested to see how something like an App Exchange or a marketplace, how stuff like that might even integrate too. So
absolutely,
an interesting thing to think about. But I know we're coming up here on time, but it's really, this was a great topic. I think we thought of a lot of other great topics just from the show here. So
absolutely, and it is now. We just rolled over to 12:30, so we should respect everybody here and wrap this up. So, John, thank you very much.
Yep.
And for all of you listening, thank you very much for joining us today. That's all we've got. We hope you learned something new today. If you liked what you heard, please, subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then join us next week at the same time for another fun and interesting topic. John, we will talk to you again next week.
Hey, see you guys.